The state is the great fiction by which everyone endeavors to live at the expense of everyone else. You may have already heard this striking quote, but do you know the man who wrote it? Today, we are going to dive into the life and thought of a fascinating author, a Frenchman idolized in the United States, quoted by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, considered by the great historian of economics Joseph Schumpeter as the most brilliant economic journalist who ever lived, and yet almost totally forgotten in his own country. This man is Frédéric Bastiat. In just 6 years of public activity, he revolutionized the way we talk about economics, wielding satire, humor, and implacable logic to destroy preconceived ideas, protectionism, and nascent socialism. In this episode, we will explore his romantic biography, dissect the works that marked his thought, such as The Law or the famous Candlemakers Petition, analyze his explosive political action during the Revolution of 1848, and finally, we will pierce the mystery of his erasure in France. Make yourself comfortable. We are heading to the 19th century to meet Frédéric Bastiat. Chapter 1. The Roots of a Freethinker. The story of Frédéric Bastiat begins in the southwest of France. He was born on June 30th, 1801, in Bayonne, into a bourgeois family of merchants. Bayonne was then a flourishing port, and this geographic anchoring is crucial. Young Bastiat grew up in an environment oriented towards maritime trade and international commerce. But fate quickly struck. Bastiat lost his mother at 7, then his father in 1810. Orphaned at 9, he was taken in and raised by his paternal grandfather and his aunt, Justine. He pursued brilliant studies, notably at the renowned College of Sorèze in the Tarn, where he forged a close friendship with Victor Calmette. It was with him that he developed an immoderate taste for the humanities, philosophy, and poetry. At 17, he left college without a degree to join his uncle's trading house in Bayonne. It is there, with his hands in the account ledgers, that he concretely observed the devastating effects of wars, blockades, and protectionism on the economy and people's lives. The asphyxiation of Bayonne's trade under the empire would mark him for life. In 1825, upon the death of his grandfather, Bastiat inherited the Sangrès estate in Mugron, in the Chalosse region. He thus became a country gentleman. He tried to apply modern agronomic methods to his lands, but it was a practical failure. He clashed with routine and his own disinterest in money. In reality, Bastiat was an intellectual. For 20 years, in the quiet of Mugron, he read, studied, and debated almost daily with his neighbor and great friend Félix Coudroy. Together, they devoured the works of Jean-Baptiste Say, Adam Smith, and especially Charles Comte and Charles Dunoyer, through the journal Le Censeur Européen. These readings forged his liberal thought. Alongside this, Bastiat got involved locally. He became a justice of the peace for his canton in 1831, and was elected general councillor of the Landes in 1832. A wise, respected man, but one who remained in the shadows, until 1844. That is when the spark occurred. One day, in his reading circle in Mugron, he stumbled upon English newspapers and discovered the existence of the Anti-Corn Law League, the Manchester League led by Richard Cobden. This British popular movement was fighting to abolish taxes on wheat imports in order to feed the poor. Fascinated, Bastiat decided he had to import this fight to France. In October 1844, he sent his first major article to the Journal des Économistes in Paris, on the influence of French and English tariffs on the future of the two peoples. The text dropped like a bombshell. The style was lively, the logic flawless. Overnight, the unknown 43-year-old provincial was invited to Paris, celebrated by the capital's great economists. It was the beginning of a meteoric career that would last only 6 years, but which would change the history of ideas. Support the channel by subscribing and leaving a thumbs up. Let's resume. Chapter 2. The Pen and the Sword. The works that marked his thought. Upon his arrival in Paris, Bastiat threw himself wholeheartedly into the battle. He published a book in 1845, Cobden and the League, and became the General Secretary of the Free Trade Association, even creating the journal Le Libre-Échange, free trade, to spread his ideas. But where Bastiat was unique was in his method of communication. Faced with academic jargon and pompous theories, he used common sense, satire, and storytelling. This gave birth to his most famous work, The Economic Sophisms, published in 2 series in 1846 and 1848. What is a sophism for Bastiat? It is an economic argument that seems logical on the surface, but is fundamentally false and misleading, often used by an interest group to hide the fact that it is enriching itself at the expense of others. The absolute masterpiece of this collection is the famous Candlemakers Petition. Listen closely to the absurdity of the reasoning that Bastiat ironically deploys. He imagines the manufacturers of candles, lamps, and streetlights sending a petition to Parliament. They demand to be protected against the unfair competition of a formidable foreign rival who floods the market with light at a price defying all competition, the sun. The petitioners therefore demand a law compelling the closing of all windows, skylights, and shutters in France. The argument? If the sun is blocked, more candles will be consumed. Therefore, more tallow will be needed, hence more oxen, more sheep, more whales hunted for oil. In short, the entire economy will be stimulated. Through this masterful satire, Bastiat ridiculed protectionism. He proved that rejecting a foreign product just because it is cheaper amounts to rejecting a gift of nature. He recalled that the goal of the economy is the consumer and abundance, and not to create arduous labor for the sole profit of protected producers. In another equally striking text, Bastiat speaks of the negative railroad. Deputies proposed creating a break in the tracks on the railway at Bordeaux to force travelers and goods to stop. This would provide a living for local porters, boatmen, and hoteliers. Bastiat pushed the logic to its limit. If it is so good for Bordeaux, let's do it in Angoulême, in Poitiers, in Tours too. Let's make a railroad composed entirely of stops, a negative railroad. Here again, he demonstrated that sacrificing global efficiency for the benefit of a particular local interest is an economic absurdity. But his most powerful concept, the one that would influence modern economics up to the concept of opportunity cost, was published in 1850 in his essay, What is Seen and What is Not Seen. To illustrate it, Bastiat invented the broken window fallacy. Imagine a child who breaks the window of his father's shop, Jacques Bonhomme. The onlookers console themselves by saying, "It's an ill wind that blows nobody good. It keeps the glazier in business." The glazier comes, installs the window, and pockets 6 francs. That is what is seen. But Bastiat alerts us to what is not seen. If the window had not been broken, Jacques Bonhomme would have had 6 francs in his pocket. With this money, he could have bought shoes or a book. The shoemaker or the bookseller would have had 6 more francs. Because the window is broken, society as a whole has not gained any wealth. It has lost the equivalent of a window. Destruction is not profit. This principle applies to the action of the state. When the government taxes citizens to finance a large project or subsidize an industry, we see the jobs created by this project. But we do not see the jobs and wealth that could never come into being because the money was taken from the taxpayers' pockets. It is a lesson in absolute lucidity. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think of the broken window fallacy? Chapter 3. Political Action, the Law and Accomplishments. In February 1848, the revolution broke out. King Louis-Philippe was overthrown. The Second Republic was proclaimed. Despite his health beginning to seriously decline, Bastiat took to the streets, created revolutionary newspapers like Jacques Bonhomme with his friends, and was elected representative, deputy, of the Landes to the Constituent Assembly, then to the Legislative Assembly. In this hemicycle, Bastiat was a free spirit. He sat mostly on the left, but he refused party logic. He said it himself. He voted with the right to defend order against socialist delusions, and he voted with the left to defend liberty against the authoritarianism of the conservatives. For example, he voted for the abolition of the death penalty, for union rights and the freedom of association, but he voted against the national workshops, a public job creation program, and against excessive taxes. His expertise was such that he was appointed vice president of the Assembly's Finance Committee 8 times. Faced with the explosion of socialist ideas of the time, those of Louis Blanc, Proudhon, or Considérant, Bastiat published one of his most fundamental texts in 1850, The Law. In this masterful little book, he returned to the philosophy of natural law. For Bastiat, life, liberty, and property are natural rights prior to any legislation. The law is there only to guarantee the right of legitimate defense of these three elements. But Bastiat sounded an alarm. The law had been perverted. Instead of protecting property, the state uses it to organize what he calls legal plunder. When the law takes from some what belongs to them to give to others, it is no longer justice. It is legalized theft. And when this plunder becomes the system, he said, the beneficiaries create a moral code to justify it. He was deeply suspicious of this political constructivism, what he called artificial organization, where legislators consider the people as inert clay that they must mold according to their own vision of fraternity. For Bastiat, true fraternity is not decreed under the compulsion of the law. It must be free and voluntary. It was during this period that he engaged in a famous polemic with Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the father of anarchism and socialist theorist. In the newspaper La Voix du Peuple, for 13 weeks, they debated the gratuitousness of credit and the legitimacy of interest. Proudhon characterized loans at interest as theft, as usury. Bastiat, on the other hand, demonstrated that capital is the fruit of savings, of a present sacrifice for the future, and that lending is a service that deserves remuneration, the rule of service for service. Faced with Bastiat's implacable logic, Proudhon lost his temper and ended up insulting him. Scientifically, Mr. Bastiat, you are a dead man. Yet, it was Bastiat who was literally dying. Afflicted by tuberculosis, his throat caused him terrible suffering, and he no longer even had the voice to speak at the Assembly's rostrum. In a final effort, coughing up blood, he wrote his great unfinished work, Economic Harmonies. Against the socialist idea of an inevitable class struggle, Bastiat defended the theory that all legitimate human interests are harmonious. In a free market, capital accumulates, the price of things decreases, and the standard of living of all rises, bringing social classes closer together. In the fall of 1850, his doctors sent him to Italy with the hope that the climate would cure him. But it was too late. On December 24, 1850, in Rome, Frédéric Bastiat breathed his last. On his deathbed, he murmured 2 words before passing away: the truth. He is buried at the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi. Subscribe for more portraits of fascinating historical figures. Chapter 4. Posterity, Tributes and The Paradox of French Amnesia. No, Frédéric Bastiat's legacy is an absolutely fascinating paradox. Let's start with his accomplishments and the tributes paid to him. Bastiat did not merely leave behind texts. He profoundly influenced the course of the global economy. The foundations he led, 10 years after his death, to the signing in 1860 of the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty, a historic free trade agreement between France and Great Britain, concluded by his disciple Michel Chevalier. On an academic level, his contribution is immense. Joseph Schumpeter said of him that there was no better economic journalist, even though he minimized his theoretical contribution. But major economists have corrected this injustice. Nobel laureate Friedrich Hayek called him a publicist of genius and often used his arguments. Better yet, Bastiat is today considered the precursor of the Austrian School of Economics. Figures of this school, such as Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard, or Mark Thornton, see Bastiat as a pioneering theorist. Why? Because Bastiat defined economics not through mathematics, but through human action and deductive logic. He theorized subjective value. the idea that the value of a thing does not reside in the labor time it cost, but in the service rendered to the consumer. On the political side, his influence crossed the Atlantic and the Channel. US President Ronald Reagan cited him as one of his greatest economic inspirations. Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, said of him, "By reading the work of Bastiat again, I discovered an elegant and powerful defense of freedom." Bastiat reminded us that the meaning of power goes from individuals upwards and not from the state downwards. It is a message for all times. In the United States, millions of copies of his book, The Law, have been sold, and think tanks as well as journalistic prizes bear his name today. But then comes the big question, the thorny question. Why is Frédéric Bastiat, this brilliant, clear, visionary thinker, recognized worldwide, virtually unknown in France, his native country, to such an extent that he is almost never taught in high schools, nor in economics or political science universities? Several reasons explain this French amnesia. 1. The hegemony of French statism and centralism. France has historically been built around a very strong state, from Colbertism under the monarchy to the Jacobinism of the Revolution, up to the post-war social model. Bastiat's ideas, which advocate anti-statism, absolute individual responsibility, and a minimal state, directly clash with the French social model. His concept of the state, perceived as a machine of legal plunder, is blasphemy for traditional French political culture. 2. Academic disdain for simplicity. In France, the intellectual world often values what is complex, abstract, sometimes jargon-heavy. Bastiat's style was crystal clear, humorous, written for the general public. Some academics, seeing his metaphors and fables, snubbed him, considering him a mere second-rate polemicist and refusing to see the praxeological depth of his theories. 3. The influence of Marxism and Keynesianism. After the Second World War, the French academic world was largely dominated by intellectual Marxism and, in economics, by state Keynesianism. Bastiat, a defender of savings, capital, free competition, and a fierce opponent of socialism, which he described as destructive and primitive, was conscientiously erased from memories and educational programs. Even his statue in Mugron suffered the ravages of time. Erected in 1878 thanks to a public subscription, it was destroyed in 1942 by the Nazi occupation to recover the bronze. It was remade after the war, but the figure of fame that accompanied it has disappeared forever. A tragic symbol. Today, rediscovering Frédéric Bastiat is like finding a 170-year-old intellectual antidote that is still incredibly effective against demagogic speeches. Whether it is justifying absurd subsidies, taxing to create jobs while destroying value elsewhere, or promising that the state can solve all problems without dipping into citizens' pockets, Bastiat had warned us. He leaves us a timeless lesson. In economics, one must never stop at what is visible at first glance. Good judgment consists in also analyzing what is not seen, the indirect effects, the lost opportunities, and the confiscated liberties. Frédéric Bastiat was neither a cold dogmatist nor a cynical financier. He was a passionate humanist who saw in the free market and voluntary exchange the only way to guarantee peace, the prosperity of the working classes, and above all, human dignity in the face of the violence of legal coercion. Thank you for spending this moment with me to unearth the memory of this forgotten giant. If you liked this podcast, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Tell me in the comments which of Bastiat's ideas strikes you the most. See you very soon for another dive into the history of ideas.